We don't waste time on window shoppers here." The words sliced through the hushed atmosphere of Morgan and Chase fine jewelry, sharp as the crystal displays that lined the walls. The elderly man's weathered hands, marked by decades at sea, trembled slightly as they held the delicate silver dolphin pendant. Around him, the afternoon crowd of Rodeo Drive's elite paused their own shopping, drawn to the spectacle of the salt-worn sailor in his faded jacket, standing before the counter where pieces started at 5 figures. The boutique gleamed like a diamond itself, all polished marble and spotless glass cases filled with treasures that caught and scattered light across the faces of Los Angeles's wealthiest patrons. The security guard by the door shifted uncomfortably, while perfectly coiffed women in designer wear exchanged knowing glances and whispered comments behind manicured hands. In the corner, a man in a vintage leather jacket and blue-tinted glasses stood very still, his attention fixed on the unfolding scene. The salesman's smile was as artificial as the pearls around his neck. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a more suitable establishment. Walmart has some lovely costume jewelry." Soft laughter rippled through the store. The old sailor's eyes hardened, not with shame, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered far worse storms than this. What no one noticed was how the man in the corner had removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that had seen similar injustice play out far too many times before. The dolphin pendant caught another ray of light, sending prismatic patterns dancing across the sailor's weathered face. Captain James Miller, though he hadn't commanded a vessel in 15 years, traced the silver contours with careful fingers that had once guided ships through typhoons. His granddaughter Sarah had fallen in love with dolphins during their last video call, her eyes lighting up as she described the pod that had played in her father's ship's wake during his latest deployment. The pendant wasn't just jewelry, it was a bridge across 3 generations of seafarers. The boutique's manager, Harrison Wells, adjusted his Italian silk tie and shot pointed looks at the security guard. In his 20 years at Morgan & Chase, he'd developed what he considered an infallible system for identifying real customers. The Cartier watches, the Hermès bags, the subtle flash of red-soled Louboutins, these were his people. This salt-worn intruder in his docker's jacket and scuffed boots was, in Wells' carefully curated world, an anomaly that needed to be corrected. Wells stepped closer, his cologne a suffocating cloud of artificial sophistication. "Sir," he said, infusing the word with carefully crafted disdain, "this particular piece is priced at $12,000. He paused, savoring the expected shock, the inevitable retreat. "Perhaps I could direct you to something more attainable?" But Captain Miller didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his worn leather wallet and retrieved a carefully folded check, edges soft from years of safekeeping. "This was my last bonus before retiring from the Pacific routes," he said quietly, his voice carrying the steady rhythm of waves. "Saved it for something special. My Sarah, she's shipping out next month, 3rd-generation Navy." The whispers around them grew louder, carrying tones of both amusement and discomfort. A young woman in Chanel dropped her shopping bag, the thud echoing through the suddenly still air. In the corner, Johnny Depp's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his sunglasses, his jaw setting in a way familiar to anyone who'd seen him defend the wronged in countless films. Wells' perfectly maintained smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself into something even more condescending. "A check?" He lifted it between manicured fingers, as if handling something unclean. "I apologize, but we don't accept personal checks." He made a show of examining the paper, especially ones that appear to be quite aged. The undercurrent of laughter from the other customers grew stronger, more confident. A woman in a red designer dress actually pointed, whispering something to her companion that made them both snicker behind their shopping bags. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to his earpiece, more from habit than necessity. Johnny Depp moved then, quiet as a shadow, his boots making no sound on the marble floor. There was something in his walk that those who knew him would recognize, the same measured purpose he brought to roles where justice needed serving. His eyes, dark and intent, held the weight of someone who understood what it meant to be judged by appearances, to have worth measured by the wrong metrics. Wells made a show of sliding the check back across the counter, letting it catch on the edge of a display case before falling to the floor. "I believe we're done here," he said, his voice carrying the practiced finality of someone used to dismissing the unworthy. "Maurice, please escort this gentleman to the door." The security guard had taken only half a step forward when a voice cut through the tension, smooth as aged bourbon and just as rich. "I'll get that." Johnny Depp bent down, retrieving the check with deliberate care. His rings caught the light as he smoothed the worn paper, studying it with the kind of attention usually reserved for precious artifacts. "Pacific Maritime Limited," he read aloud, his voice carrying easily in the now silent store. 20 years of service bonus. He looked up, meeting Captain Miller's eyes with quiet recognition. "That's a lot of storms weathered, a lot of cargo brought safe to harbor." The boutique's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Phones emerged from designer purses, their cameras catching the surreal scene unfolding in the high-end jewelry store. Wells' complexion had taken on an interesting shade of pale, his carefully cultivated superiority wavering as he realized exactly who was now involved in his carefully managed situation. "You know," Depp continued, still holding the check with careful respect, "I've played a lot of sailors in my time, pirates, captains, even a tourist on a boat once." A small, knowing smile played at the corners of his mouth. "But I've always had tremendous respect for the real ones, the ones who actually live that life." Captain Miller stood a little straighter, years of maritime discipline evident in his bearing. 23 years on the Pacific routes," he said, his voice carrying the quiet pride of a man who knew his true worth. "Started as a deckhand, worked my way up, every port from Singapore to San Francisco." "That's quite a journey," Depp nodded, then turned to Wells with an expression that would have been familiar to anyone who'd seen him face down corruption in film after film. "You know, I've spent a lot of time in ports around the world, met all kinds of people, and I've learned something interesting." He picked up the dolphin pendant, letting it catch the light. "The worth of a person isn't in the clothes they wear or the way they look. It's in the stories they carry." The boutique had become remarkably still, the kind of silence that falls before a storm breaks. The woman in the red dress who had been pointing earlier was now trying very hard to become invisible behind a display case. Several phones were live streaming, their owners torn between embarrassment at the situation and the viral potential of the moment. "This check," Depp continued, holding it up so everyone could see, "isn't just paper. It's 23 years of Christmas mornings missed while bringing other people's gifts to shore. It's birthdays celebrated over satellite phones. It's watching your children grow up in photographs while you keep the world's commerce flowing." His voice carried the weight of someone who understood the true cost of sacrifice. Wells' professional demeanor was crumbling by the second. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his grasp. "Mr. Depp, while we certainly appreciate your patronage, we have established policies regarding payment methods that I simply cannot—" "Established policies," Depp repeated the words slowly, testing their weight. Interesting phrase. He turned slightly, addressing the growing crowd of onlookers who were now completely captivated. "You know, I've played characters bound by established policies before. Pirates had them. They called it the Code." A smile touched his lips, familiar to millions. But as Captain Barbassa might say, they're more like guidelines, really. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the boutique. The tide of public opinion had shifted completely, and Wells could feel it. His carefully constructed fortress of exclusivity was crumbling around him. Behind him, another employee, younger and clearly uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," she said, addressing her manager, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "the check can be verified. We do have procedures for special cases." Her voice gained confidence as she continued, "And Captain Miller has been waiting very patiently." The silence that followed was charged with potential energy. Captain Miller stood quietly, years of navigating treacherous waters evident in his calm demeanor. He'd weathered hurricanes and rogue waves. The petty storm of human arrogance was nothing in comparison. Johnny Depp, standing beside him now, had become something more than just a celebrity. He was the embodiment of karma, the balancing force that the universe occasionally sends when the scales of dignity tip too far in the wrong direction. Wells looked from Depp to his employee, then to the crowd of customers whose phones were still recording every moment of his humiliation. His carefully constructed world of hierarchies and appearances was collapsing, and he could feel control, his most prized possession, slipping away. Something ugly flashed across his features before he composed himself. "I'm afraid policy is policy," he said, voice brittle as thin ice. "We cannot accept a personal check of this vintage. Perhaps you misunderstood our establishment, Captain." The title came out twisted, almost mocking. "We cater to a certain clientele." "A certain clientele," Depp echoed thoughtfully. He turned to Captain Miller. "You know, I've spent most of my life being judged by appearance. Too weird, too different." He gestured at himself with a self-deprecating smile. "But I've learned something valuable along the way." He placed the check back on the counter, smoothing it carefully with ringed fingers. "True worth isn't in how you look or what you own. It's in what you've lived through, what you've contributed." His eyes, intense as dark amber, fixed on Wells. "And by that measure, I think this man has earned the right to be respected in any establishment." The young employee had begun processing the check, her fingers moving across the computer keyboard despite her manager's glare. Around them, the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been mockery, there was now shame. Where there had been dismissal, there was attention. The woman in the red dress who had pointed earlier was now studiously examining her manicured nails, her face flushed with embarrassment. Captain Miller reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He placed it beside the dolphin pendant, and in the pristine showroom of luxury, this faded image somehow commanded more attention than all the diamonds surrounding it. "This is my granddaughter, Sarah," he said, his weathered finger gently touching the face of a young woman in a naval uniform. "Third generation serving. She ships out next month for her first deployment. 23 years ago, before her father's first tour, I bought my daughter-in-law a similar pendant." His voice remained steady, yet carried an ocean of emotion beneath its surface. "She wore it until my son came home safe. Now it's Sarah's turn." Depp picked up the photograph, studying it with genuine interest. "The tradition continues," he said softly, then looked around the store, his gaze touching each face, leaving no one untouched by the moment. "You know what's interesting about jewelry?" he asked, his voice carrying the philosophical weight that had made him more than just an actor. "We think it's valuable because it's rare or expensive, but the most precious things we own are valuable because of the stories they carry." He lifted the dolphin pendant, letting it catch the light. "This isn't just silver and craftsmanship, it's 3 generations of service. It's family, it's hope." His eyes found Wells again, and that's something no price tag can really capture. The boutique was utterly silent now. Several customers had put their phones down, the moment having transcended the desire to capture content and become something more meaningful, something that demanded to be experienced rather than recorded. The young employee finished processing the check and looked up with quiet determination. "The payment has been approved, Captain Miller." She reached for a blue velvet box, carefully placing the dolphin pendant inside with the reverence it now deserved. Her actions were a direct challenge to her manager's authority. But in that moment, something had shifted in the boutique's hierarchy. Integrity had outranked position. Wells stood frozen, caught between his ingrained prejudice and the undeniable reality that his worldview had just been publicly dismantled. His carefully constructed persona was cracking, revealing the insecurity beneath. The silence stretched until he finally managed a tight nod, stepping back from the counter in wordless surrender. "You know," Depp said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who had learned what truly matters, "I've collected a lot of things in my life, some worth a fortune, some worth nothing to anyone but me." He gestured around the boutique. "All this beauty, all these precious things, they're just objects until they become part of someone's story." He turned to the other customers who now watched with expressions ranging from shame to revelation. "The most valuable thing I own is a cheap plastic bracelet my daughter made me when she was 7. Couldn't sell it for $1, but I wouldn't trade it for anything in this store." Captain Miller accepted the blue velvet box, his weathered hands closing around it with gentle purpose. The moment had transformed him from an object of ridicule to the central figure in a story about dignity and worth, a transformation reflected in the faces around him, now filled with respect where mockery had been. As Captain Miller tucked the blue velvet box safely into his jacket pocket, something remarkable happened. A woman in designer clothing approached him, her earlier disdain replaced by genuine contrition. "My son is in the Army," she said softly. "Third tour in Afghanistan. I'd like to shake your hand if that's all right." Others followed, a quiet procession of people whose perspectives had been visibly transformed. The boutique had become something else entirely, not just a temple of luxury, but a place where something genuine had broken through the veneer of superficiality. Johnny Depp stepped back, watching with quiet satisfaction as the ripples of change spread through the store. Wells had disappeared into a back office, the collapse of his authority too much to bear publicly. The young employee who had processed the check now stood taller behind the counter, something fundamental having shifted in her understanding of her own power to choose right over rules. Outside the boutique, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Rodeo Drive as Captain Miller and Johnny Depp walked together, an unlikely pair united by a moment of unexpected justice. Neither spoke immediately, sharing the comfortable silence of those who understand that some experiences need time to settle. "She'll love it," Depp finally said, nodding toward the pocket where the pendant rested, "and she'll understand what it really means." The captain nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Value isn't just what something costs." "No," Depp agreed, "it's what it's worth." Already the story was spreading. Videos were being uploaded, shared across platforms, commented upon by thousands. The boutique's name was trending, though not in the way its marketing team would have preferred. But something more important was happening alongside the viral moment. People were sharing their own stories of judgment, of assumptions, of the times they'd been measured by the wrong metrics. 3 weeks later, Sarah Miller stood on the deck of the USS Nimitz, the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly before her. Around her neck hung the silver dolphin pendant, catching the first light of dawn. She touched it gently, reading again the note her grandfather had sent with it. "The man who sold me this said something I'll never forget," Captain Miller had written. "The most precious things we own are valuable because of the stories they carry." This carries our family story now, 3 generations on the water, serving something larger than ourselves. What he hadn't written was the full story of that day. though Sarah had seen it online like millions of others. The video had become something more than viral content. It had sparked conversations about worth, about judgment, about the invisible stories we all carry. In Los Angeles, a young jewelry store employee began her first day as assistant manager, her promotion coming after the previous manager's mutual decision to part ways with the company. Her first act had been to change the store's policy on payment methods. And somewhere, Johnny Depp smiled as he read another message from Captain Miller. A photo of Sarah in uniform, the silver dolphin gleaming against her navy blues, carrying a story that no price tag could possibly capture.